Welcome back to Soft Spoken Mysteries, where we explore the achievements and wonders of history that leave us amazed by human capability. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying tonight's deep dive, a quick like helps more curious minds discover these incredible stories. Tonight, we're exploring one of history's most extraordinary military minds. A man who conquered more territory than anyone else in recorded history. More than Napoleon, more than Alexander the Great, more than Caesar. And yet, most people have never heard his name. This is the story of how a blacksmith's son became the greatest general the world has ever seen. In the spring of 1241, two European armies were destroyed on the same day by Mongol forces operating nearly 800 miles apart, one in Poland, one in Hungary. These weren't small skirmishes. These were massive, coordinated operations that required perfect timing, flawless communication, and strategic genius operating at a continental scale. Both victories were orchestrated by the same man, who was simultaneously commanding operations across thousands of miles of territory, from China to the edges of Western Europe. His name was Subutai, and what he accomplished should have been impossible. The coordination alone defies belief. Remember, this was the 13th century. No telegraphs, no radio, no satellites, no modern communication systems whatsoever. And yet Subutai commanded multiple armies, separated by distances that would take weeks to cross, executing synchronized maneuvers with precision that would impress modern military planners with all their technology. But here's what makes Subutai's achievement truly staggering. He didn't just win battles, he conquered more territory than any other military commander in human history. During his career, Subutai personally directed over 20 campaigns and conquered 32 nations. He led armies across distances that span from Poland to Korea, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The territory he conquered and held would eventually comprise the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Let that sink in for a moment. One man, one lifetime, more conquest than Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, or any other legendary commander you can name, combined. And he did it all starting from the humblest possible origins. Subutai wasn't born into nobility. He wasn't a prince or a king's son. He was born around 1175 in northwestern Mongolia, the son of Subutai, a blacksmith. In Mongol society, blacksmiths occupied a respected but decidedly non-noble position. Subutai's family herded sheep. They worked with their hands. They weren't warriors by birth, they weren't aristocrats, they weren't part of the ruling class. And yet this blacksmith's son would become the primary military strategist for Genghis Khan and his successors. The man who would make the Mongol Empire's expansion possible, the architect of victories that would reshape the entire known world. How did he do it? How did someone from such humble origins rise to command armies that would conquer more of the world than anyone before or since? How did he coordinate operations across impossible distances with such precision? How did he consistently defeat armies that outnumbered him, using strategies that military academies still study today? Tonight we're going to explore the methods, the strategies, and the sheer brilliance that made Subutai the most successful military commander in history. We're going to understand how he planned campaigns that spanned continents, how he coordinated forces across thousands of miles, how he adapted Mongol tactics to defeat every type of enemy he encountered, from Chinese siege warfare to European knights, from Russian principalities to Hungarian cavalry. This is the story of the general history forgot, the mastermind behind the Mongol conquests, the man who proved that genius and capability matter far more than birthright. This is the story of Subutai, the greatest general the world has ever known. Subutai's story begins in the vast steppes of Mongolia, in a region near the Onon River. The exact year of his birth is debated by historians, but most place it around 1175 or 1176. His family belonged to the Uriankai clan, Mongol pastoralists, who moved with the seasons, following their herds across the endless grasslands of Central Asia. His father, Subutai, was a blacksmith. This was an important trade in Mongol society, but it wasn't a path to power or prestige. Blacksmiths made weapons and tools, essential work, but they weren't warriors or nobles. Young Subutai would have grown up helping his father with the herds, learning the skills of survival on the steppe, but with no apparent path to greatness. What changed everything was his family's connection to another family on the steppe. A family led by a man named Temujin, who would later become known to history as Genghis Khan. The connection went back generations. According to Mongol historical records, Subutai's great-great-grandfather had been an ally of an earlier Mongol Khan. When Temujin and his followers were going through desperate times, struggling to survive in the harsh steppe environment, Subutai had provided them with food and support. This act of loyalty and generosity created a bond between the families. More importantly, Subutai's older brother, Gelmi, had already joined Temujin's growing band of followers. Gelmi would become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders, and when Subutai was around 13 years old, his father presented him to Temujin as well, offering his youngest son into the great leader's service. Now here's where Subutai's remarkable nature first becomes apparent. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the most important primary source document about this period, when Subutai knelt before Temujin to swear his oath of allegiance, he didn't offer the standard pledges of loyalty. Instead, he made a promise that revealed his strategic mind even at that young age. He told Temujin that he would be like a rat that gathers things, collecting all that the leader needed. He would be like a black crow that protects its nestlings, defending Temujin's family. He would be like a felt blanket, covering and protecting. And he promised to go forth like a horse, trampling Temujin's enemies wherever they might be found. It wasn't just poetry, it was a strategic vision, logistics, intelligence gathering, protection, offensive operations. At 13 years old, Subutai was already thinking like a general, understanding that warfare required more than just courage and a sword. Temujin recognized something special in this blacksmith's son. He accepted Subutai into his personal guard, an elite unit called the Keshig. This wasn't just an honor, it was an education. The Keshig served as a military academy, a place where young men learned strategy, leadership, and the art of war directly from the Khan himself. And Subutai proved to be an exceptional student. He watched, he learned, he absorbed everything about Mongol military doctrine, about the coordination of cavalry units, about the use of scouts and intelligence, about strategic planning. But more than that, he began to innovate, to think beyond the traditional tactics of steppe warfare, to imagine campaigns on a scale that had never been attempted before. His first opportunities came during the unification of Mongolia. As Temujin fought to bring the various Mongol tribes under his control, Subutai distinguished himself in combat. But more importantly, he distinguished himself in planning and execution. He understood logistics, the unglamorous but absolutely critical work of keeping armies fed, equipped, and mobile. He understood timing and coordination. He understood how to use terrain and weather to advantage. By 1206, when Temujin finally unified the Mongol tribes and took the title Genghis Khan, Subutai had already proven himself valuable enough to be given independent command. He was around 30 years old, young for such responsibility, but Genghis Khan recognized talent when he saw it. And in Subutai, he had found something rare, a strategic genius who could not only execute the Khan's plans, but envision and accomplish operations on a scale Genghis himself might not have imagined. In 1211, Subutai got his first major test. Genghis Khan launched an invasion of northern China, targeting the Jin dynasty. This was Subutai's first experience with warfare beyond the steppe, his first encounter with siege warfare, with walled cities with a completely different style of combat than the mobile cavalry tactics of the Mongols. And this is where Subutai's genius truly began to show. He didn't just apply Mongol tactics to a Chinese context. He learned, he adapted, he studied Chinese siege engineering, incorporated Chinese military specialists into Mongol forces, and began developing the combined arms approach that would make Mongol armies nearly unstoppable. The campaign in China would last for years, and throughout it, Subutai was learning lessons he would apply on a global scale. How to breach fortifications, how to conduct siege warfare, how to coordinate cavalry operations with infantry and siege engines, how to supply armies for long campaigns in enemy territory, how to use intelligence networks to map enemy positions and movements. But his real opportunity, his chance to show what he could do with independent command on a massive scale, came in 1213. Genghis Khan gave Subutai a mission that would prove to be one of the most consequential in military history. The Merkits and their allies, the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation, had fled westward, beyond the borders of the known Mongol world. These were dangerous enemies who had to be eliminated. Genghis Khan ordered Subutai to pursue them, to hunt them down wherever they might go, to ensure they could never threaten Mongol power again. What Genghis Khan didn't fully realize at the time was that he had just given Subutai permission to explore and potentially conquer everything to the west. And Subutai was going to make the absolute most of that opportunity. Subutai caught and defeated the Merkits in central Kazakhstan in 1217. He defeated them again in 1219. But rather than returning to Mongolia with news of victory, Subutai kept going west. He was gathering intelligence, mapping territory, understanding the political landscape of Central Asia and beyond, building the knowledge base that would make the Mongol invasions of the West possible. And then came one of the most audacious military operations in history, an operation that would showcase everything that made Subutai a military genius of unprecedented caliber. In 1219, Genghis Khan launched a massive invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful Islamic states in Central Asia. This was a huge, complex campaign across vast territories. And in the middle of this campaign, Subutai proposed something that must have seemed almost insane. He asked permission to take a detachment of Mongol cavalry, break off from the main army, and conduct a reconnaissance in force all the way around the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, through Persia, into the Caucasus, and beyond, to gather intelligence on the lands to the west. Genghis Khan agreed, and Subutai, along with another brilliant general named Jebe, set off on what would become one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history, a campaign that would span years and cover distances that stagger the imagination. They rode through Persia, smashing every army sent against them. They penetrated into the Caucasus Mountains, defeating Georgian forces. They emerged onto the steppes of southern Russia, where they encountered peoples and kingdoms that had never seen Mongol warriors before. And everywhere they went, Subutai was gathering information, recording the terrain, understanding the political divisions, mapping out trade routes and communication lines, building a comprehensive intelligence picture of an entire region of the world. But the real test came in 1223 at a place called the Kalka River. A coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies had assembled a massive army to stop this Mongol raiding force. The Russians had somewhere between 30,000 and 80,000 men. Accounts vary, but it was a huge force by any standard. Subutai's detachment probably numbered no more than 20,000. The Russians were confident. They had numbers. They had home territory advantage. They had alliances with local forces who knew the land. How could this foreign raiding party possibly stand against them? What happened next became a masterclass in military deception and strategic brilliance. Subutai began by retreating. For days the Mongols fell back before the advancing Russian army, drawing them forward, making them overconfident, letting them think they were pursuing a beaten and frightened enemy. The Russians followed eagerly. They were going to crush these invaders. They were going to drive them back to whatever barbaric lands they had come from. And then on May 31st, 1223, Subutai turned around and destroyed them. The details of the battle show Subutai's tactical genius. He used the terrain, positioning his forces to maximize the effect of Mongol horse archers, while minimizing the Russians' numerical advantage. He used timing, coordinating his units to hit the Russian forces at multiple points simultaneously. He used psychology, creating panic and confusion that broke the Russian formation. But here's what really shows Subutai's brilliance. During the battle, his co-commander Jebe was killed. Some historians believe Jebe was caught in an ambush, possibly killed in somewhat embarrassing circumstances. Suddenly, thousands of miles from any support, deep in enemy territory, Subutai found himself solely in command, facing an army that still outnumbered him significantly. A lesser commander might have retreated, might have tried to escape back to Mongolia with whatever forces he could save. Subutai finished the battle, achieved a complete victory, and then continued his reconnaissance mission. The Russians suffered catastrophic losses. Their princes were captured. The survivors fled in panic, and Subutai had sent a message to the west. The Mongols were coming, and they were unstoppable. But here's where it gets interesting. On the return journey to Mongolia, passing through the territory of the Volga Bulgars, Subutai's forces were ambushed. The Bulgars used their knowledge of local terrain to set traps, drew the Mongols into feigned retreats of their own, and inflicted real losses on the Mongol force. Many modern popular histories gloss over this, presenting Subutai as undefeated. But the primary sources are clear. The Bulgars hurt him. They showed that the Mongols could be beaten by opponents who used their own tactics against them and who knew their local terrain. And what did Subutai do with this defeat? He learned from it. He studied what the Bulgars had done. He understood their tactics. And 18 years later, when the Mongols returned to this region in force, the Bulgars were among the first to be conquered. Subutai had remembered every lesson. He'd turned a tactical defeat into strategic knowledge. This entire expedition, this multi-year reconnaissance in force covering thousands of miles through unknown territory, demonstrated something unprecedented in military history. Subutai hadn't just survived far from home in hostile territory. He'd won victories. He'd gathered intelligence. He'd mapped out the political and military landscape of half a continent. And he'd returned with the information that would make the Mongol conquest of the West possible. Modern military historians look at this campaign and struggle to find parallels. The coordination required, the intelligence gathering, the ability to adapt to completely different types of warfare, from mountain combat in the Caucasus to steppe warfare in Russia. The leadership to keep his men disciplined and effective across years of campaigning far from home. The strategic vision to understand that he wasn't just winning battles, he was preparing for future campaigns that would happen years or decades later. Genghis Khan had sent Subutai to chase down some tribal enemies. Subutai had mapped the way for the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe and laid the groundwork for what would become the largest contiguous empire in human history. And he was just getting started. When Subutai returned to Mongolia in 1224, after an expedition that had taken him around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus and across the Russian steppes, he brought back something more valuable than gold. He brought knowledge, maps, intelligence about the kingdoms to the west, understanding of their military capabilities, their political divisions, their strengths and weaknesses, but the immediate focus returned to China. The Jin dynasty still held out in the north, and Genghis Khan wanted to finish what he'd started. This is where we see another dimension of Subutai's genius, his ability to master completely different types of warfare. In 1226, Subutai played a key role in the campaign against the Xia Empire. These were sophisticated opponents with walled cities and defensive fortifications. Steppe cavalry tactics alone wouldn't work. You needed siege engineering. You needed patience and systematic reduction of enemy strongholds. You needed combined arms operations that integrated cavalry, infantry, and siege engines. Subutai had learned all of this during the earlier campaigns in China, and now he applied it at a higher level. He directed operations against fortified cities. He coordinated complex sieges. He managed supply lines across difficult terrain. He demonstrated that he wasn't just a brilliant cavalry commander. He was a complete military strategist who could master any type of warfare. But then came a blow that shook the entire Mongol world. In 1227, Genghis Khan died. For many empires, the death of the founding conqueror means the end of expansion. Succession crises tear apart carefully built alliances. Generals compete for power. The vision that drove conquest dissipates into civil war and fragmentation. The Mongol Empire didn't fragment, largely because of men like Subutai. He supported the succession of Genghis Khan's son, Ogedei, as the new Great Khan. He continued to serve with absolute loyalty and effectiveness. He proved that the Mongol military machine wasn't dependent on any single leader. It was a system, a set of doctrines and capabilities, and Subutai was the master of that system. Under Ogedei, Subutai returned to the conquest of China, and here we see his strategic flexibility in full display. In 1230 to 1231, the first Mongol attempt to break into the plains of Honan ended in failure. Subutai was actually defeated at a battle called Shan Chehui, a rare setback for the master strategist. But defeat taught Subutai lessons, just as it always had. He studied what had gone wrong, he adjusted his approach, and in 1231 to 1232 he returned with a better strategy and achieved decisive victories at Sanfeng, Yangyi, and Tieling in rapid succession. Then came one of Subutai's most impressive achievements in China. Ogedei and the main Mongol army returned to Mongolia, leaving Subutai with only a small force to complete the conquest of an entire region. A lesser commander would have waited for reinforcements. Subutai maneuvered. He used speed and surprise. He exploited political divisions among his enemies. He turned a numerically inferior force into a victory through pure strategic brilliance. By 1234, the Jin dynasty was finished. After decades of warfare, the entire northern region of China was under Mongol control, and Subutai had been central to this achievement, demonstrating that he could win campaigns through patience and siege warfare just as effectively as through rapid cavalry operations. But the conquest that would cement Subutai's reputation as the greatest general in history was yet to come. The campaign that would showcase every aspect of his genius. The operation that military historians still study as perhaps the most sophisticated pre-modern military campaign ever conducted, the Mongol invasion of Europe. In 1235, at a great council called a Kurultai, the Mongol leadership decided to launch a massive invasion to the west. The target was Europe. The goal was nothing less than the conquest of the entire continent, and Subutai was placed in operational command, with Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, as the nominal leader for political purposes. But everyone knew who was really planning and directing this campaign. Subutai, now in his 60s, was about to conduct his masterpiece. The scale of what Subutai planned is breathtaking. He wasn't thinking about conquering a single kingdom. He was planning a multi-year, continent-wide campaign that would require the coordination of multiple armies across thousands of miles of territory, operating simultaneously against different enemies in different types of terrain, all while maintaining supply lines back to Mongolia and managing political relationships with conquered territories. Modern general staffs with satellite communications and computer modelling struggle with operations on this scale. Subutai did it with messengers on horseback. The invasion began in 1236 with the subjugation of the Volga Bulgars. Remember them? The people who had ambushed and defeated part of Subutai's force nearly 2 decades earlier? Subutai had not forgotten. He'd studied their tactics, he'd planned for them, and when the Mongol armies returned in force, the Bulgars were overwhelmed. Subutai had turned his one major tactical defeat into a comprehensive strategic victory. From 1237 to 1238, the Mongols systematically conquered the Russian principalities. City after city fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, Kiev. These weren't small towns. They were major centers of civilization, with stone fortifications and determined defenders, and Subutai's armies took them all. But here's what's remarkable. While conducting these sieges, while managing the conquest of the Russian principalities, Subutai was simultaneously planning the next phase of the campaign, the invasion of Central Europe. He was sending scouts into Poland and Hungary. He was gathering intelligence about the terrain, the military capabilities, the political divisions of kingdoms he hadn't even attacked yet. He was planning operations that wouldn't take place for years, while simultaneously winning the battles happening right now. The level of strategic foresight is staggering. By 1240, Subutai was ready for the main event, the invasion of Hungary and Poland, and what he planned was unprecedented in military history. A coordinated, multi-pronged invasion that would hit multiple targets simultaneously, hundreds of miles apart, all timed to achieve maximum strategic effect. The Mongol forces divided into multiple armies. One force would invade Poland, drawing away potential reinforcements and pinning down Polish forces so they couldn't help Hungary. Another would strike through Transylvania, attacking Hungary from the south. The main force under Batu and Subutai would smash through the Carpathian Mountains from the east. And all of these operations had to be coordinated in time. The armies had to move according to a schedule that would bring them to their objectives at the precise moments needed for the plan to work. Without radios, without telegraphs, with nothing but pre-planned timing and trusted subordinates who understood their roles, it worked, with a precision that seems impossible for the 13th century. On April 9, 1241, the Mongol force in Poland destroyed a coalition army at the Battle of Legnica. Duke Henry II of Silesia was killed. Polish military power was shattered. 9 sacks of ears were collected from the fallen, testimony to the scale of the slaughter. 2 days later, on April 11, 1241, 800 miles to the south, Subutai destroyed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. Let's understand how remarkable this is. 2 major European armies defeated on virtually the same day, by forces operating across distances that would take weeks to cross. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was planning on a level that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The Battle of Mohi itself is worth examining in detail because it showcases every aspect of Subutai's tactical genius. The Hungarians had assembled a massive army. King Bela Fior had somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men. Accounts vary, but everyone agrees the Hungarians significantly outnumbered the Mongols. The Hungarian force included heavy cavalry, considered among the best in Europe. They had infantry, they had crossbowmen, they had fortified their camp with wagons arranged in a protective circle. They held a strong defensive position near the Sarjo River, with natural barriers protecting their flanks. By every conventional measure, the Hungarians should have had the advantage. Subutai spent several days before the battle, conducting reconnaissance and probing attacks. He wasn't just harassing the enemy, he was learning. He was understanding how the Hungarian forces reacted. He was identifying their commanders' tendencies. He was studying the terrain. Every skirmish before the main battle was gathering intelligence that Subutai would use when the time came. On the night of April 10th, Subutai put his plan into action. And what a plan it was. Batu Khan would lead a frontal assault across the main bridge over the Sarjo River. This would draw Hungarian attention and commit their forces to defending that crossing. Meanwhile, Batu's brother Shiban would take forces north to find a ford and cross the river there, attacking the Hungarian rear. And Subutai himself would go south, construct a temporary pontoon bridge in secret, and cross with the main strike force to hit the Hungarians from an unexpected direction. Think about the complexity of this plan. 3 separate forces moving in darkness, having to coordinate their movements to hit the enemy simultaneously from different directions. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the surprise would be lost. Too late, and Batu's frontal assault would be destroyed before support arrived. At dawn, Batu attacked the bridge. The Hungarians defending it fought fiercely, and Batu's forces were taking heavy casualties. Mongol sources admit that at this point, Batu lost 30 of his personal bodyguards and one of his top lieutenants. The attack was in serious trouble, but Subutai's timing was perfect. His pontoon bridge was completed, his forces crossed the river, and just as the Hungarian defence was on the verge of repelling Batu's assault, Subutai's army smashed into their flank and rear. The Hungarians retreated to their fortified camp, wagons arranged in a circle, still holding together as a fighting force. They still outnumbered the Mongols. A determined defence might yet save them. This is where Subutai demonstrated perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his tactical genius, the use of psychological warfare combined with tactical positioning. The Mongols surrounded the Hungarian camp, but left one obvious gap in the encirclement. To the west, there was an apparent opening, an escape route. And as the Mongol assault intensified, as explosives and arrows rained down on the camp, as the situation became increasingly desperate, Hungarian commanders made the decision that Subutai had been waiting for them to make. They ordered a retreat through that opening. It was a trap. The gap in the Mongol lines led to swampy, difficult terrain. As the Hungarian army poured through this apparent escape route, they spread out. The knights in their heavy armour found the ground treacherous. Infantry became separated from cavalry. The organised fighting force that might have held against a direct assault dissolved into scattered groups of fleeing men. And then the Mongol horse archers, mobile and organised, picked them apart. They pursued the fleeing Hungarians across the countryside. Historical sources report that corpses littered the landscape over a distance that took 2 days to ride. The Hungarian losses were catastrophic, somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 men killed, 2 archbishops dead, 3 bishops dead, multiple high nobles killed or captured. King Bailith IV barely escaped with his life. Subutai had destroyed one of the most powerful armies in Europe, commanded by experienced leaders, defending on their own territory with numerical advantage through a combination of brilliant planning, perfect timing, tactical flexibility, and psychological manipulation. But here's what often gets overlooked in simpler accounts of this battle. It wasn't easy. Mongol casualties were significant. Batu's forces suffered heavily in the initial assault. Subutai's engineers struggled to build the pontoon bridge in deeper water than expected. The Hungarian forces fought hard and inflicted real losses before they were finally broken. This wasn't a simple walkover. It was a hard-fought victory against formidable opponents, won through superior planning, coordination, and execution, which makes Subutai's achievement all the more impressive. After Mohi, Hungary lay open to Mongol conquest. The kingdom had lost nearly a quarter of its population in the invasion. Half of the inhabited places were destroyed. The military power that might have resisted was shattered. The Mongols prepared to continue west. Scouts were sent into Austria. Plans were being drawn up for invasions of the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, possibly even France. Subutai, at the height of his powers, having just achieved perhaps the most sophisticated military campaign in medieval history, was preparing to conquer Western Europe. And then everything stopped. News arrived from Mongolia. Ogadai Khan had died, and according to Mongol tradition, all the princes had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Europe was saved not by military resistance, but by biology and politics. The death of a Khan thousands of miles away halted an invasion that no European army had been able to stop. Subutai returned to Mongolia. He participated in the selection of the new Khan. He served in administrative roles. He lived to see his sons and grandsons rise to positions of command in the Mongol military. He died in 1248, around the age of 72 or 73, having served 3 great Khans and having conquered more territory than any other military commander in history. But to truly understand Subutai's achievement, we need to go beyond just the battles and the conquests. We need to understand the methods and systems that made his success possible. Because Subutai wasn't just a talented general who won through personal courage or tactical brilliance. He was a systematic thinker who built capabilities and doctrines that made the Mongol military machine nearly unstoppable. Let's start with intelligence and reconnaissance, because this was perhaps Subutai's greatest advantage. Modern military doctrine talks about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance as the foundation of successful operations. Subutai understood this centuries before it became formal doctrine. Before every major campaign, Subutai sent scouts, sometimes months or even years in advance. These weren't just soldiers riding ahead to see what was over the next hill. They were trained intelligence gatherers who collected information systematically. They mapped terrain. They identified key resources like water sources and grazing land. They observed enemy forces and reported on their capabilities, organization, and morale. They even engaged in what we'd now call human intelligence, talking to merchants and travelers to understand political divisions and potential allies. By the time Subutai's main force arrived in a region, he already knew the terrain better than many of the people who lived there. He knew where the enemy forces were, how they were organized, what their supply situation looked like, what political tensions he could exploit. He was making decisions based on comprehensive intelligence, while his enemies were often operating blind. The European invasion is the perfect example. Subutai had been gathering intelligence on Poland and Hungary for years before the actual invasion. When his armies crossed into these kingdoms, they already had detailed maps, knew the major routes and river crossings, understood the political relationships between different nobles, and had identified which fortifications were strong and which were vulnerable. This intelligence preparation made the actual military operations far more effective. Next, let's talk about logistics, because this is where many great military campaigns fail. Armies need food, water, equipment, ammunition. The longer the supply lines, the harder this becomes. Many conquerors have watched their armies disintegrate because they couldn't keep them fed and equipped in enemy territory. Subutai mastered logistics on a scale that seems impossible for his era. He kept Mongol armies operational across thousands of miles of territory, sometimes for years at a time. How did he do it? First, Mongol armies were designed to be as self-sufficient as possible. Each warrior brought multiple horses, allowing them to cover vast distances by switching mounts. They carried dried meat and milk products that didn't spoil. They could live off the land when necessary, hunting and foraging. The Mongol army was mobile in a way that European armies, dependent on supply wagons and baggage trains, simply couldn't match. But Subutai went beyond just using traditional Mongol logistics. He organized supply bases in conquered territories. He established relay systems for messages and supplies. He calculated how much food and equipment would be needed for campaigns months in advance, and made sure it was positioned where it would be needed. During the European invasion, Subutai managed to keep multiple armies supplied simultaneously across territories stretching from Poland to Hungary to Russia, all while conducting active combat operations. The logistical planning required for this is staggering. Modern military professionals look at what Subutai accomplished and struggle to understand how he did it without computers and modern transportation. Then there's training and discipline. The Mongol military system that Subutai operated within was highly sophisticated, but he took it to another level. Mongol warriors were trained from childhood. They learned to ride before they could walk. They practiced archery until they could hit targets at full gallop. They participated in huge hunting expeditions called the Great Hunt, which were essentially large-scale military maneuvers disguised as hunting trips. But Subutai demanded more. He insisted on discipline that was remarkable for the medieval period. Mongol units had clear chains of command based on a decimal system. 10 warriors formed an arban, 10 arbans formed a jagun of 100, 10 jaguns formed a mingun of 1,000, 10 minguns formed a tumen of 10,000. Each level had a commander who was responsible for his unit's training, discipline, and combat effectiveness. This organizational structure meant that Subutai could issue orders to commanders at the tumen level, knowing that those orders would flow down through the ranks and be executed precisely. He could coordinate movements of multiple tumens across hundreds of miles, confident that each unit would perform its role. The discipline Subutai maintained was extraordinary. Mongol armies didn't loot until they were given permission. Units stayed in formation during combat instead of breaking to chase individual enemies. Commanders followed strategic plans, even when tactical opportunities might tempt them to deviate. This discipline was what allowed Subutai to execute complex multi-phase operations like the invasion of Hungary. When he planned for Batu to attack the bridge at dawn, for Shiban to hit the northern flank at a specific time, and for his own force to strike from the south at the perfect moment, he could trust that each commander would do exactly what they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do it. Compare this to the European armies Subutai faced, feudal levies where nobles commanded their own followers and might or might not follow the king's orders. Forces that fought for personal glory as much as strategic objectives. Armies that could dissolve into chaos if their leaders were killed or if they saw an opportunity for plunder. Subutai had professional soldiers operating within a sophisticated command structure. This institutional advantage was as important as any individual tactical brilliance. Now let's talk about tactical flexibility and innovation, because this is where Subutai really distinguished himself from other great commanders. The basic Mongol tactical system was built around horse archery and mobility. The standard approach was the feigned retreat, drawing enemies out of position, then turning and destroying them with superior archery and maneuver. These tactics had been refined over centuries of steppe warfare. Subutai mastered the traditional tactics, but he didn't stop there. He innovated constantly, adapting Mongol methods to different enemies and different types of terrain. Against Chinese cities, he incorporated siege engineering. He learned to use trebuchets, siege towers, and mining operations. He integrated Chinese engineers into Mongol forces, creating a combined arms capability that could breach fortifications as effectively as it could win open-field battles. Against Russian principalities, he developed methods for winter campaigning that leveraged frozen rivers as highways for rapid movement. European armies generally avoided winter operations because of the difficulty of moving and supplying forces in harsh conditions. Subutai turned winter into an advantage, using frozen waterways to move faster than enemies expected and to attack fortifications from unexpected directions. Against European heavy cavalry, he developed tactics specifically designed to counter their strengths. The Mongol response to a charge by armoured knights wasn't to meet them head-on, which would negate the Mongols' mobility advantage. Instead, Mongol forces would retreat, drawing the knights into extended pursuits that tired their horses, then turning and using archery to target the horses rather than the heavily armoured riders. Once the knights were dismounted, they became much less effective. Subutai also developed what modern military doctrine would call operational art, the link between tactical battles and strategic campaigns. He didn't just win individual battles, he orchestrated sequences of operations that achieved strategic objectives. The Hungarian campaign is the perfect example. Subutai's strategic goal wasn't just to defeat the Hungarian army, it was to conquer Hungary itself. So he planned operations that would isolate Hungary from potential allies, destroy its military forces, and break its capacity for resistance, all while positioning Mongol forces for further expansion into Central Europe. Every battle Every siege, every movement of forces served the larger strategic plan. And when tactical situations changed, as they inevitably do in war, Subutai could adjust without losing sight of his strategic objectives. This kind of thinking was extremely rare in the medieval period. Most commanders thought in terms of winning the next battle. Subutai thought in terms of campaigns spanning years and covering continents. Let's also discuss Subutai's use of psychological warfare, because this was a sophisticated tool that he wielded with great skill. The Mongol reputation for ruthlessness was partly deserved and partly calculated propaganda. Stories spread ahead of Mongol armies about cities destroyed, populations massacred, resistance crushed with terrifying brutality. These stories weren't just accidents of war, they were tools. When Mongol armies approached a city, the defenders had to make a choice: resist and face the possibility of total destruction, or surrender and potentially be treated relatively well. Subutai made sure that examples of both outcomes were well publicized. Cities that surrendered quickly might be spared. Cities that resisted faced harsh consequences that would be talked about for generations. This created a psychological environment where resistance seemed futile. Why fight to the death when the Mongols were going to win anyway? Why sacrifice your city when surrender might save it? These doubts undermined the will to resist before the actual fighting even started. Subutai also used psychological operations during battles. The feigned retreat wasn't just a tactical maneuver. It was psychological manipulation, making enemies overconfident, drawing them into bad decisions, creating the feeling of victory that would make the subsequent defeat even more crushing. At Mohi, leaving a gap in the encirclement was brilliant psychology. The Hungarian commanders, facing what looked like certain death if they stayed in their camp, saw an apparent path to safety. The urge to take that opening, to save their army by retreating, was overwhelming, and it was exactly what Subutai wanted them to do, because it would turn an organized fighting force into scattered groups of vulnerable fleeing men. Modern military doctrine emphasizes understanding the enemy's decision-making process and manipulating it to your advantage. Subutai was doing this in the 13th century. We should also examine Subutai's approach to combined arms warfare, because this was truly ahead of its time. Medieval armies generally had different types of units that operated somewhat independently. You had cavalry, infantry, archers, maybe siege engines. These would be present on a battlefield, but they weren't necessarily integrated into a cohesive system. Subutai created forces where different unit types worked together seamlessly. Light cavalry for reconnaissance and harassment, heavy cavalry for shock charges, horse archers for ranged firepower, infantry for holding positions and supporting sieges, engineers for breaching fortifications. Each type of unit had specific roles, and they were trained to work together. In a typical Subutai battle, you'd see light cavalry screening the main force and providing intelligence. Horse archers would weaken enemy formations from range. Heavy cavalry might conduct shock attacks at key moments. If there were fortifications involved, engineers would support with siege equipment, while cavalry controlled the surrounding territory. This integration of capabilities made Mongol armies far more flexible and effective than forces that were built around a single dominant unit type. Against European armies that relied heavily on heavy cavalry charges, Subutai could deploy formations that neutralized that advantage. Against Russian forces that used a mix of infantry and cavalry, he could adapt with different combinations of his own forces. Against Chinese cities, he could shift to siege operations without needing to bring in a completely different army. The combined arms approach also meant that Subutai had responses to unexpected situations. If an enemy used tactics he hadn't anticipated, he had the tools to adapt. Modern militaries take this for granted. In the medieval period, it was revolutionary. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when discussing military genius: Subutai's political and diplomatic skills. Great generals don't just win battles, they operate within political systems. They manage relationships with rulers. They understand that military operations exist within larger strategic and political contexts. Subutai excelled at this. He served 3 different great Khans, Genghis Khan, Ogaday, and Guyuk, maintaining his position and influence through changes of leadership that destroyed many other commanders' careers. He navigated the complex politics of the Mongol court, where different factions competed for power and influence. He also understood how to exploit political divisions among his enemies. Before invading a region, Subutai would study the political landscape. Were there rivalries between kingdoms, disputes between nobles, religious or ethnic tensions? These divisions could be exploited either by driving wedges between potential allies or by making alliances with factions willing to cooperate with the Mongols. In Russia, Subutai exploited the divisions between different principalities, preventing them from uniting against the Mongol threat. In Europe, he took advantage of political tensions between Hungary and its neighbours, ensuring that Hungary couldn't count on timely help when the invasion came. This political acumen was as important as tactical brilliance. The greatest battlefield victories mean nothing if you can't translate them into lasting strategic gains. Subutai understood this, and he operated at both levels simultaneously. Let's consider the question of command and control, because this is where Subutai's achievement becomes almost superhuman given the technological limitations of his era. Commanding an army in battle is challenging enough. Commanding multiple armies operating across hundreds or thousands of miles, with only messengers on horseback for communication, conducting coordinated operations that require precise timing, all while adapting to changing circumstances. This should have been impossible. Subutai made it look routine. His secret was a combination of thorough planning, clear communication, trust in subordinates, and adaptable doctrine. Before a campaign, Subutai would develop a detailed plan that every commander understood. They knew their objectives, their routes of march, their timing, and how their operations fit into the larger strategic picture. But Subutai also trained his subordinates to think independently and adapt to circumstances. They understood the overall plan well enough that they could make adjustments when local conditions required it, without waiting for new orders from headquarters. This balance between centralized planning and decentralized execution is something modern militaries strive for and often struggle to achieve. Subutai managed it in the 13th century. The European invasion shows this at the highest level. Multiple armies operating in Poland, Transylvania, and Hungary, all moving according to a coordinated timetable, each achieving its objectives despite operating independently for weeks or months at a time. This required commanders who could be trusted to execute the plan, communication systems that could get critical information to where it needed to be, and a level of organizational sophistication that was unprecedented for the medieval period. Let's also examine what made Subutai different from other great military commanders. Alexander the Great conquered a vast empire, but he did it in a relatively concentrated period of time, following a linear path from Greece through the Persian Empire. He also had the advantage of commanding what was already the most sophisticated military force of his era, the Macedonian army, built by his father, Philip. Julius Caesar was a brilliant tactical commander and a master of political military operations, but the territory he conquered was limited compared to Subutai, and he was operating within an established military system with well-developed logistics and infrastructure. Napoleon revolutionized European warfare and conquered most of the continent, but he had the advantages of post-Renaissance military technology and the resources of a centralized French state. He also ultimately failed, his empire collapsing within his lifetime. Subutai conquered more territory than all of them. He did it with relatively simple technology. He created much of the military system he used rather than inheriting it. He maintained success across nearly 4 decades of continuous campaigning. He never lost a major campaign, and he did all of this starting from the position of a blacksmith's son, rising entirely on merit and capability. The scale and duration of Subutai's success is unmatched in military history. The diversity of enemies he defeated, from Chinese fortifications to Russian winters to European heavy cavalry. The geographical scope of his operations, from Korea to Poland. The sophistication of his planning and execution. When you examine all of these factors together, the case for Subutai as the greatest general in history becomes very strong. But perhaps what's most impressive is how Subutai's methods influenced warfare far beyond his own lifetime. The Mongol military system he did so much to develop and perfect remained effective for generations. His descendants and students continue to win victories using the principles he'd established. More broadly, the concepts Subutai pioneered would appear again and again in military history. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the integration of different arms into cohesive fighting forces, the use of mobility and maneuver to achieve strategic objectives, the coordination of operations across vast distances, the psychological dimensions of warfare. All of these would become standard parts of military doctrine, but Subutai was implementing them centuries before they were formally systematized. Modern military professionals who study Subutai's campaigns are struck by how relevant his methods remain. The technology has changed. We have radios and satellites and computers now. But the fundamental challenges of warfare, understanding your enemy, coordinating your forces, maintaining your logistics, achieving your strategic objectives, these remain constant. And the solutions Subutai developed to these challenges still work. There's something else worth considering about Subutai's legacy. The Mongol Empire he helped build, despite its reputation for conquest and destruction, also created conditions for unprecedented cultural and economic exchange. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, unified an enormous region under stable rule. The Silk Road trade routes flourished as never before. Ideas and technologies flowed between East and West. Chinese innovations reached Europe. Islamic scholarship influenced Mongol courts. European merchants travelled to China. The exchange of knowledge that occurred during this period helped set the stage for the Renaissance. This wasn't Subutai's goal. He was a military commander focused on conquest, but the empire he helped create had consequences far beyond the battlefield. The connections formed during the Mongol period changed world history. It's also worth reflecting on what Subutai's career tells us about merit and capability versus birth and privilege. Subutai was born to a blacksmith. In most societies of his era, this would have been a permanent limitation. Noble military commands went to nobles. Leadership positions went to those born into the right families. Skill and intelligence mattered less than bloodline. The Mongol system, at least under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, operated differently. Merit mattered. Capability was rewarded. A blacksmith's son who showed genius and dedication could rise to the highest military commands. This meritocratic approach was one of the Mongols' great strengths. They didn't waste talent by restricting positions to hereditary elites. The best fighters fought, the best leaders led. And this meant that someone like Subutai, who might have spent his entire life as a herder or craftsman in another society, could become the greatest general in history. The modern world likes to think of itself as meritocratic, but even today, privilege and connections often matter as much as capability. Subutai's story reminds us of what human beings can accomplish when talent is recognized and rewarded regardless of birth. Let's spend a few moments on what we don't know about Subutai, because the gaps in the historical record are themselves interesting. We have good information about Subutai's major campaigns and victories, but the details of his personal life are sparse. What was he like as a person? What did he think about when he wasn't planning campaigns? What were his relationships with his family? How did he relate to his soldiers? Did he have doubts? What did he fear? The historical sources, mostly focused on military and political events, give us little insight into Subutai the human being. We know he was described as modest and loyal. We know he attributed his success to the Mongol way of war rather than personal genius. We know he remained devoted to Genghis Khan's family through multiple generations of leadership. But the inner life of one of history's most successful commanders remains largely hidden. We can infer from his actions that he was intelligent, adaptable, patient, and strategically minded. We can see that he could inspire loyalty and maintain discipline. We can observe his tactical brilliance and strategic vision. But what he felt, what he hoped for, what kept him awake at night, these things are lost to history. We see his achievements, we see his methods, but the man behind those achievements remains somewhat mysterious. This is worth remembering when we study historical figures. We see their accomplishments, but we often miss the human being who lived through doubts and fears and uncertainty, just like anyone else. Subutai won more victories than any other commander in history, but he was still a human being, subject to all the pressures and challenges that come with that condition. We also don't fully understand all of his tactical methods. Military historians can analyze the battles and campaigns, study the sources, understand the broad strokes of what Subutai did. But the specific details, the exact tactical decisions that made the difference between victory and defeat, much of this is lost. How exactly did Subutai coordinate timing between armies hundreds of miles apart? What specific intelligence did his scouts gather? How did he brief his subordinate commanders? What were the detailed logistics that kept his armies supplied? We can infer and reconstruct, but we don't have the detailed tactical manuals or after-action reports that might tell us exactly how it all worked. This makes Subutai's achievements even more impressive in a way. He did all of this without leaving behind a comprehensive written doctrine for future generations to study. The Mongol military system was passed down through oral tradition and practical training more than written texts. Subutai's genius lived in his actions and in the commanders he trained, rather than in books and manuals. As we near the end of our exploration, let's return to the question we started with. How did a blacksmith's son become the greatest general in history? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't just talent, though Subutai clearly had exceptional intellectual gifts and strategic vision. It wasn't just opportunity, though serving under Genghis Khan certainly opened doors. It wasn't just the Mongol military system, though that system provided tools and capabilities that Subutai used brilliantly. It was all of these things together, combined with dedication, learning, adaptability, and relentless attention to every detail that might affect military operations. Subutai was brilliant, but he also worked incredibly hard. He studied his enemies. He learned from defeats as well as victories. He constantly improved his methods. He trained subordinates who could execute complex operations independently. He built systems and capabilities that made success more likely. He also had the right temperament for command. He could plan years in advance while also adapting to immediate circumstances. He could delegate authority while maintaining overall control. He could be patient in siege warfare and aggressive in mobile operations. He could understand both the tactical details and the strategic picture, and perhaps most importantly, he never stopped learning. From his first campaigns in Mongolia to his final operations in Europe, Subutai was always observing, analysing, improving. The tactics he used against Russian principalities incorporated lessons from Chinese siege warfare. The strategies he employed in Europe built on decades of experience across Asia. Every campaign made him better. Every victory and every setback taught him something he could use in future operations. This commitment to continuous improvement, this intellectual flexibility, This willingness to learn from any source, these qualities are what separated Subutai from other talented commanders who might have had similar opportunities. So here's what we can learn from Subutai's story. Talent matters, but so does dedication. Intelligence is valuable, but so is the willingness to learn from experience. Strategic vision is important, but so is attention to tactical details. Leadership requires both planning and adaptation. Success comes from systems and methods as much as from individual brilliance. And perhaps most importantly, Subutai teaches us that human capability can transcend the limitations of birth and circumstance. A blacksmith's son, through genius, dedication, and opportunity, became the most successful military commander in human history. He conquered more territory than anyone before or since. He developed methods and strategies that remain relevant centuries later. He demonstrated that merit and capability, when recognized and rewarded, can achieve the seemingly impossible. This is what makes Subutai's story one of the great achievements in human history. Not just the victories, though those are impressive. Not just the territory conquered, though that's unprecedented. But what those achievements represent. The possibility of excellence, the power of human intelligence and dedication, the potential that exists in people regardless of their origins. Subutai was born to a blacksmith in the steppes of Mongolia. He died having conquered more of the world than Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon, having developed military methods that influenced warfare for centuries, having demonstrated capabilities that still seem impossible given the technological limitations of his era. He deserves to be remembered not just as a great general, but as one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. A testament to what can be accomplished through genius, dedication, and relentless pursuit of excellence. As we close tonight's exploration, consider what we can take from Subutai's story. About the importance of continuous learning, about the value of systems and methods alongside individual talent, about the power of preparation and intelligence gathering, about the need for both strategic vision and tactical flexibility, about the potential that exists in human beings when merit is recognized and capability is rewarded. Subutai showed us what's possible. A blacksmith's son who conquered the world through brilliance, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The greatest general history has ever seen. The master strategist whose methods shaped warfare for centuries. The man who proved that human capability can achieve the impossible. Tomorrow night, we'll explore another incredible story from history. Another wonder, another achievement, another example of human capability that leaves us amazed. Until then, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most extraordinary individuals. If you enjoyed tonight's exploration, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, a quick like helps more people discover these incredible stories from history. This has been Soft Spoken Mysteries. Good night, and may your curiosity lead you to wonders.